We're going to do one more on this. So the first one I titled Selflessness and Confronting the Truth. And this one, in the prior, we were looking at information that is released into the field on discovery. And so what most people posit is that there is some occulted notion to information, and that even though it's done out in plain view and that transparency must be an integral aspect of this, many of the themes that are involved with engineering, social engineering, creating an environment where people will ultimately sin against themselves, that's fine and dandy. Or is it? I mean, it's a terrible atrocity. But to take this even further and to say that the technological ability, if you even want to go towards psionics and certain abilities there, is that we are going to produce the shadow government or this great work, or however you want to esteem it, right? These elitists who think that they are above everyone and are trying to build in the field around them, around all of us, supremacy that allows them, gotta pop my, hips are getting really tight. They're going to build themselves into the informational system so that they are inevitable and an aspect to the axis of power that we all require, the entropy, if you will, but goes on to an even further notion as to say that the observation that principles are at the root, and that this energy system that can only be obtrusively reviewed as the monad, John Dee's hieroglyphic monad, is in fact something that we can only call the pure source, the pure center, right? Then I get into other conceptualizations that I call the flicker, that I came up with, well over 15 years ago, around 15 years ago, where I reached this inevitable conclusion that if we were to try and create a planar field, right, spinners or spiners, right, however you want to describe it, when you get into Penrose and other people who are looking into this, right, this quantum field in operation, and then to look at Hameroff as well and to go out, you're saying that this localization of these agitated fields going through this sort of torsion field, energetic self-emanation and supply, where, like I say, I'll overuse this term perspicacious, but from an ontological sense, right, that we might get into this observational field that implies fully that a person has to go into this complexity of thought and understanding, and that this is part of the process, this is part of the passage, and that they're allowed to mislead you, right? But in this allowance, they've doomed themselves, where if you make it beyond where they are now disqualified and left null. So in other words, everyone represents an aspect of the informational system. Everyone, even if they are errors, which the majority of us are, which is bizarre because it shows an elasticity where there's something very unnatural about nature, but the computational ontology seems to have an elastic quality where it snaps back, but it does so, returns back like Stretch Armstrong kind of thing, right? But it takes a certain amount of time. So it gets into the number systems and the number subsets of, and the idea of, are you serving the greater good? Most people would say yes, if you keep our current status and state of reality alive. Most people say yes. And then they contradict themselves, where it's like, but you believe in Jesus. You believe that Jesus stated he's going to bring fire to the world. You believe that he stated, the observable Jesus stated that he was going to bring disharmony to the households, and that you are a part of that household, and that, in other words, he's going to make damn sure and be a part of the movement that says, stated in the field, you are an error, and therefore, like in the gospel of truth, if you really want to look at the jars, it's very interesting, right? Where you are an error, your family members are errors. The anomaly that you might not turn out to be such an error is 1 out of 1,000, 2 out of 10,000. He states the numbers right there, right? Also talking about the pleroma, those are spheres. Talks about the agitation in Gnostic gospels and texts. That is entropy, right? Talks about the pleroma, that's enthalpy, that's totality. Like, really think about this and look at it. It's not even that mercurial in its scope. So what you're left with, right, is in the prior we were talking about selflessness and the fact that, oh yeah, you will have to be selfless. You'll have to more than be selfless. You're going to have to actually come to the place of your own physical demise, your own physical death, and even more so, your own moral death, and even more so, the identity of self. You will get wiped away. And so you begin to look at the universe and going, what the fuck's going on here? This is evil, right? And it is a sifting system, a disparate, compartmentalized, that's what it is. It's separating you, if you are one, if you are listening to this, if you do see, okay, 1 out of 1,000, 2 out of 10,000. Now, this brings light to an even more complex subject matter. Is if you have space, or if we're in some laboratory and we just see black space, because our eyes, even from a molecular standpoint, or if you want to look at Planck's wall, or this maximum halving distance, maybe we exist beyond that. And we can be observed almost like Xenobots or Anthrobots, Dr. Michael Levin's work, and we're looking out at this darkness in space and seeing stars, but that's not really what's happening. What's happening is like cargo cults of the past. We are unable to even fathom or see what the fuck is actually right there in front of us all along. We're just not capable of seeing it, right? The light, there is no light that we can see that is refracting off of those greater bodies who could be very much like us, and we could be I think it's highly likely actually that we are existing almost like from a digloca point of view of where the only thing that makes sense is that it's beyond perceivable, the perceivable light spectrum. From a molecular standpoint, we're just incapable or unable to see the greater reality, right, of what's going on here. Highly likely, in my opinion. But we get into selflessness and we get into this, the order of this, because what's happening is ultimately there is the question of, how does a cosmos become a cosmos? When we go through the complex ontology or the nature of reality, of how things work themselves out, they don't make sense on a moral sliding scale. In other words, it's not just this eye for an eye, a tooth for a tooth. It has nothing to do with that. That is not what ultimate truth comes down to. It deals with things on a very complex subject matter, where and I've used this as an example before, and it has to be used because this is how the principles work, and this is what ultimately leads one to the conical opening that's inferred as the 33 degrees on a sliding scale, mind you, of this, that nothing, no sphere is ever complete. That when you begin to get into these conceptualizations of geometric unity or really sacred geometry, when you get to the completion of that third body, like Zeroth's law, proposed law, when you get into this equilibrium and these bodies that are trying to reach an entropy sort of state, the third object or sphere is never completed. There's always a transfer through of information. So in other words, the transference in the number system of 369, 9 is never completed. Or is it? It depends on if you're standing from the view of the original 3. If you are now not in movement with, but you are looking from the standpoint of 3, and you are seeing the bifurcation into 6, right? And we're talking about a point in time or time itself and how time moves, and then you're looking all the way through that distance of 9. You're not looking behind you as the number system completes, and that there is a tearing off of the 9 and there's a taking away from the 3, right? And this happens so instantaneous and so rapidly that you would think that there's a unity between 3, 6, 9, and there is, but it represents a point in time, right? So when we get into this, so that we're not going off on a tangent, you have to see this esoteric mathematical construct as the formulation of the self, right? And the fact that you are never complete, that you're always under the construct of the construction of completion. And so it gets back to the Gospel of Thomas. The secret to everlasting life is to never stop seeking, right? So seeking more than implies an active notion of going through a physical effort to actually seek, right? Seeking implies a deliberate, intentional intelligence gathering, or going into a formalized ontological thought through process, right? And seeing that, oh, this is a system that's going to get us from point A to point whatever, right? Point Z, really. And then we can repeat the cycle again, right? So we see that the Ouroboros and the Zodiac represent all parties on it through the totality of a systemized movement pattern, where one subset of ontology or intellect doesn't really understand that it's, or what it's serving, right? But so you see, like, the 9 layers of the human body work very much in the way. The symbiotic nature of nature itself, if we want to look at it like that, the world around us, right? That many of these species don't even understand how that their entire reason for living is just to shit on that bird is just to shit on that cactus and produce those flowers, and that this is going to aid in a system that their own minds could never fathom the complexity of the whole thing. They just know they're a part of it, right? I used to use the terminology, the sun doesn't measure its own rays, its own wave patterns, right? Or does it? Is it so aware from an ontological sense of its extension, of its ability? So I urge you to see The Arcadian for this purpose, and that was a Canadian, I think Irish-US joint venture that Nicolas Cage was involved in. And the only thing that I can refer to the proto-beings, if you will, that were a part of this, that were the horrific aspect of this, but it really is just facing the ontology. And it was such a good, like, you had the depiction of the story of Cain and Abel in that. You had the selflessness and the sacrifice, which the father did, but he did so because you get into parallax views, right? You get into blindsidedness, but then you get into the fact that could you escape from, and this is really the summary here, okay? Could you escape from the self? Is it at all necessary for you to escape from the self? And this is what gets people involved, like this whole Dolores Cannon white lighter bullshit, right? That gets people involved with this sort of karma hopping, where it's like, it even infers like many worlds, where many worlds is going. Or dare I even mention like Boltzmann brain, which I like to bring up pretty often, is the fact that a brain would emerge long before the completion of a universe would, right? And so if nothing is complete, and if the brain is complete, then it is something that is complete in an incomplete cosmos. In other words, it was amalgamating based on presuppositions. It was recombinating or combinating from a beginning standpoint based on the energetics of an inferred complete universal construct. And if the universe isn't complete and cannot be complete and wasn't complete when the Boltzmann brain had become assumably complete, then there is an error code built into the fabric of the mind, if that makes sense. So in other words, if you haven't experientially gone through completion, right? And if you couldn't even wake up in a day because it's like, you're never going to complete anything in your life. All these merits and all these systems, things that give you a degree or a certification, or say that you completed a course, when you really go back, were you paying attention 100%? Is the information transferable? Like, is a doctor from 200 years ago the same as a doctor now? Which one do you want to work on you, in other words? When you have an emergency, are you going to go back in time and, I'd much rather have brain surgery done by someone 200 years ago? Come on. So there's a big disparaging discrepancy going on here, right? So knowledge and information, the ontology isn't transferable yet. Can you say, like when you look into Tartary and so forth, that we are progressing? No. So when you look at the great work, it's this moving of information of where attention goes, energy flows, right? So when you get into identity and the identity of a self, it very much has to do with the presupposition of who are you today? Who are you in this incarnation, this karma? Who are you in this lifetime, right? What do you represent? And so what the Master Key states, right, which is the confluence, the conjecture of the Freemasons, right, linking back to the Society of the Cincinnati, linking back to why the immigrants came here and were used in the first place, such as my lineage, coming from Pfungstadt, Germany, a 100 years war based on the fleeing of witchcraft, only to be entered back into this. You get back into this conceptualization of Nicolas Cage, the Arcadian, where you have this spider, monkey, snake. You have this skinwalker. You have this monster that can transpose and become anything. And it's like, if your mind couldn't wrap around it, and it was trying to get along with you, and it was trying to figure out how do we live and you live at the same time, and then you both realize that your existence is so diametrically opposed to the existence of something else that is so beyond your scope that all you can do is kill it. We're going to end it right there.